Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Auf Bunga Bunga, the global politics podcast. At the end of history, we're once again talking about American politics in this sort of occasional series that we're doing called Mr. Bunga Goes to Washington. This is the second part, I suppose, of this. And we're joined by Nicholas Kiersey. Nicholas is a professor of political science at the University of Texas, Rio Grande Valley. And he also does the Fully Automated podcast, which you should definitely check out. You can also search for it by searching for Occupy IR Theory. There's a blog that it's hosted on. Anyway, welcome, Nick. Great to have you.
Thanks, guys. It's really nice to be here. And Alex, thank you for the warm welcome.
Yeah, no, it's great to have you. And it's actually this is rather belated. We should have had you on quite a long time ago, actually. So it's good to finally do it. Listeners, of course, if you're familiar with me, I'm Alex Hochuli. This podcast is produced by myself, George Hoare, who's in London, and Phil Cunliffe, who's in Canterbury. You guys can say hi too.
Hi.
Yo.
Very good. So now we all know each other. We can get started. As I said, we're talking about the American election. We are trying to digest what has happened in terms of the Bernie campaign, maybe trying to unpick the pros and the cons of the campaign, what the reasons for the failure was, as well as trying to maybe get a little insight into what the campaign trail was like. And maybe get some sort of on the ground depictions of what it was like from Nick. And then we'll kind of try to open it up outwards into some broader political questions. But before we get started with anything else, we need to ask the really pressing question. Who do you want Biden to pick as a VP? Because I think this is really important. It's obviously the most important position in politics in the world. And I want comedy suggestions only. So who do you want, guys?
I think the obvious choice is Biden. I mean, he's a proven VP, and I think that Biden. Why? If it's not broken, don't fix it.
Right.
Biden bot, or Biden brain in a VAT ticket. That's a winner.
That's it.
So I'd go for double down on Biden.
You want Biden, but as a bot, like one of those Westworld bots, when they go into analysis and they just say, bring your affect down. So it's a Biden who probably won't sexually molest anyone, won't get too emotional, will be fine with a bit of malarkey. So that's a good option.
So hair touching down from 20 to like 5 out of 20.
No finger sucking. Yeah, I think it's a good suggestion. Yeah, no, any serious, I mean, the thing is about this, I was thinking about it, when you're thinking about what the confrontation will be like at, the kind of general election between Trump and a Democrat, you think, well, obviously you want it to be Bernie, but if it's not Bernie, I guess Michael Bloomberg would be interesting because it would show what an oligarchy the US is, etc.
It has to be a woman, though.
Well, right.
Because Biden has committed to that.
So who's your Veep suggestion, Nick?
Oh, Debbie Wasserman Schultz. I don't know. That would be
Warren.
Warren.
Comedy suggestions only, George.
I mean,
Warren would be a comedy suggestion. Go ahead.
No, my perfect ticket, even better than Biden is get Biden out, get Hillary in, and get Warren as the VP. I mean, that's pretty good. But as long as it's Hillary.
The problem there, if I may, and I'm probably breaking the sequence of this, so forgive me for jumping in. But the problem there, I think, is that Warren's brand is bust, and I don't think it's coming back anytime soon. I actually think she would be a net liability, and I think the establishment Dems know that. They understand that she's burnt so many bridges that she basically was seen by pretty much everyone who with a progressive, that's sort of not a PMC progressive. And I know the audience of this show knows what a PMC is, so I'm not going to break that down. But anyone to the left of the sort of suburban Facebook empathy mom class is not going to go for that.
Yeah, I mean, actually, maybe we should talk about that now.
That's interesting.
Because Warren's campaign was spectacular failure, really, given its potential. So maybe, what is your take on that? Like, how did she ruin her brand?
And I haven't actually grasped the fact that she's completely ruined herself. Looking from the outside in, I mean, on US politics, it's not really that visible. So it's interesting.
Yeah, no, they've shut her up. I mean, when was the last time you heard anything from her in the media?
Only saying that she believes Joe Biden didn't sexually assault anyone.
Yeah, I mean, if she said that, then I didn't hear much about it. But I mean, basically, she's been out of the loop, out of the mix altogether, I think.
I'm gonna get a T-shirt. Believe Biden. You know, like not believe women crossed out. Just believe Biden.
I mean, it was fine early on for Warren. I mean, I think she had a pretty solid reputation going in. A lot of people liked her. A lot of, she had a good crossover potential from the kind of centrists to the left. A lot of them would have been open-minded to her. I can remember even in late 2019 Facebook debates with certain people, sort of, shall we say, more extreme leftists saying like, no, she's a neoliberal, whatever. But like, in fairness, even people like Bhaskar Sankara of Jacobin were kind of defending her online, saying, no, she's more like some kind of Keynesian economics champion. And they, so there was a kind of a rallying to her early on. And there was this kind of, even in the early debates, I think in January, a real kind of like, Bernie and Warren back to back on the same stage. Isn't it amazing to have this kind of pincer move? Joe Biden's getting destroyed because Warren's giving him the hard swing, and then Bernie is kind of cleaning up. And there was a kind of a, notable amount of people sort of saying like, wow, whoever thought we'd see two progressives on stage going after Biden like this? And, you can even throw in Tulsi Gabbard there if you want and say there were three. But, she had it all to play for early on, I think. But clearly just decided to listen to her campaign managers a bit too much, I think, and sort of tried to openly stab Bernie Sanders in the chest with a Me Too argument that just completely backfired and I think eventually just withered on the vine. She should have pulled out. She should have pulled out before Super Tuesday.
So you agree with what Trump said, basically, that she ruined Bernie at Super Tuesday?
I think she already had caused Bernie a lot of damage earlier on. I think she should have pulled out much earlier before Super Tuesday.
Out of interest, so what struck me was, what struck me was how many of political scientists seem to be pro-Warren. And I was surprised by that because I thought they would see through the kind of the whatever appeal she might have had. I thought they would see through the kind of the technocratic veneer, the heavily kind of caked, layered, kind of makeup. That it was so self-consciously presented about being about expertise, and that they would be able to see through that and see that it was kind of a shtick. So anyway, I wondered, was that your experience? Did you find that many academics were very pro-Warren as opposed to Bernie?
I like having a career, Phil, and
I was going to say that we don't need to include this in the final version if you don't want to.
You can spill the tea. The tea can end up spilt, and nobody has to claim responsibility.
Nobody has to know. I'll let you know if I feel it comes to that. But I mean, I think I personally did feel a very upset, for want of a better term, that so many people in my wider academic networks, who they're not stupid people, they're very intelligent, but were standing for Warren, seemingly on the basis of a number of different things. But I suppose you primarily would say, the inclusivity, that she's a woman and that she seems to have this sort of technocratic bent. And I think this is something that, just reveals the lie for a lot of even, say, critically minded political scientists that often make their paychecks on the assertion that, we need critical methods, we need emancipation, we need, intersectionality, all of these things. And then just sort of when it washes out, you find out even leading names in the discipline have kind of shilled out and contributed to Kamala Harris and things like this. So there's there's a whole conversation that needs to be had there. I don't know if you guys want to do it on this show, but I mean,
we all know who you're talking about, Pete.
Yeah.
I mean, and I think it is just worth making that point, that there's a big disconnect between the multisyllabic theory words that some
it's staggering.
Academic stars put in their articles, and then what they actually do, or whose campaigns they contribute to.
Yeah, but then also if you're sort of like a young career or early career critical theorist, you have to name check a lot of people on the way up the greasy pole, and I don't know what happened somewhere along the line. I think people internalize it, and there's a kind of a hunkering down, or either maybe a genuine ideological alignment that takes place along the way, where people just end up committed to someone like Warren or Kamala Harris.
Yeah. So we got stuck into Warren perhaps a bit earlier than we were expecting. So
Sure.
before we jump back into it and talk a bit more in depth, could you tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, how you came to volunteer for the Bernie campaign, what your role was exactly, and how you got that weird accent?
Weird accent. Okay, well, I was born and raised in Ireland and moved to the States, actually it's 20 years ago now, this year, to do a PhD. And I ended up at Virginia Tech, graduated the year of the infamous shootings there. So that was a nice way to sort of celebrate the end of many years of work on a thesis. I ended up writing my dissertation on Hart and Negri and the debate about American unilateralism, or debate about American empire. So that's kind of my intellectual background, so to speak, as a globalization theorist. And then ended up moving to Ohio for a position there, spent 10 years living in Columbus, Ohio, and now recently moved to Texas, where I have been involved with a local DSA chapter, helping set that up, and also campaigning for Bernie Sanders.
So what was your role in the campaign? So what did you have an official position as a volunteer? What did you
No,
end up doing?
I didn't take any official positions. I just was sort of a foot soldier, really, going door to door, making calls here in a very, very Hispanic part of Texas. I live on the border with Mexico, and basically it's Edinburgh or McAllen, Texas. The area is known as the Rio Grande Valley, and it's a very interesting area electorally, actually, because it's despite the fact that Bernie famously did super well with Hispanics nationally, this would not be an especially progressive Hispanic population for idiosyncratic reasons, which I don't fully claim to understand. But there is a kind of an indigenous Hispanic population here, which is Texan, going back hundreds of years, and it's not necessarily self-identifying as immigrant labor. Whereas if you go to Iowa or California and you have these large Hispanic populations there that are more recent immigrants, these are the people, of course, that Bernie Sanders' campaign advisor Chuck Rocha was, a genius at targeting. That's something we can talk about later on. I think it was a really big role in the success of the campaign, such as it was, especially early on, that they really had a huge ground game among the Hispanic population nationally. It's instrumental in their victory in California, which was monumental, it must be said. You can't take that away from them. But here locally, we have just a sort of an older Hispanic population, and more difficult to fire up. Definitely, it's a little bit post-political down here where I live. And that said, we did get in the county that I live in, we did win, and that's I was very happy about that.
Just out of interest, the indigenous Hispanic Texans you reference, they're Republicans or they're Democrats, but for other candidates?
It's a blue area. For example, you might be interested in this. We had a really brilliant candidate with the Justice Democrats running in the adjacent district to ours, and her name was Jessica Cisneros. She got a fair bit of media attention and a lot of endorsements from Warren, from Bernie, I believe. And she was running against an old Democrat incumbent by the name of Henry Cuellar. Cuellar is the most conservative Democrat in the U.S. Congress right now and votes with Trump almost more than even Republicans do. So, but he is, policy for policy, vote for vote, he is the most Trump-leaning Democrat. So the idea was that, he was ripe for the picking. So she primaried him and did very, very well. I mean, she came from 0 to getting within, I think, 5 points, which was very impressive.
Oh, wow. So
it is a blue area, to answer your question.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, kind of at the bigger level, discussion of U.S. politics. I mean, discussion of politics everywhere has been overwhelmed by the COVID crisis, and we'll come back to that. But could you put us in the picture as to where things are at now? So Bernie has folded and is going to said he'll support whoever the party goes for against Trump. But where do we stand in terms of the current kind of pattern of where do we stand with relation to the Democratic primaries, and what do you make of these? I don't know if they're just kind of on the outside, whether or not it's kind of only picked up on the outside, but what do you make of these rumors that they might actually stand Biden down and replace him with Hillary?
Yeah, and just to tack onto that, I definitely don't feel like you're giving us too simple a story, because I think the eclipse by COVID has been very real in terms of I can barely remember what's going on in American politics at the moment. I think it's difficult to get your head up and look at across the pond. Some bare facts are useful.
Yeah. So just to sort of start, I suppose, with where we are with the primaries, Bernie has hung up his spurs, so to speak. The way they phrase that usually is they've suspended their campaign, and of course, what that means is that they're not legally finished with their campaign, which still gives them leverage for potential convention maneuvers. Were say Biden to become extremely ill and have to withdraw, then of course it means that his votes would have to be allocated, and you would have a potential scrum for trying to run primaries between now and November. New York, for example, still has to run now. Whether all of these are sort of fantastical scenarios, and but it basically means that Bernie would still have a nominal pathway to win, or at least leverage some platform policies for the election as we went into November. Those aren't unimportant, right? I mean, one of the things I'm sure we'll be talking about later on is, what can the Bernie movement do? What can it accomplish now? What can it hope for? And, those kinds of questions really do become very interesting. We just saw, I don't know if you guys were following this, but yesterday it was announced that a court had struck down New York's plan to basically strike Bernie from the primary, and that's now handled, which is good news. The rumors that Biden is, senile or, too mentally deficient to be able to sort of perform in office aren't going away. I think the really interesting story that's been gathering steam here is the sexual harassment allegations. I don't foresee them going away anytime soon. The woman in question seems to be gaining, Tara Reid is her name. She seems to be gaining more and more credibility as time goes by, because little bits and pieces of her story are starting to check out. Certainly there's no smoking gun as of yet, but the little anecdotes and bits and pieces of her story are checking out when they're cross-referred to people she knew at the time, or documents that may or may not have been prepared around about that time. So that there's some witnesses, there's some rumors of documentation being stored in the University of Delaware, which would maybe attest to her story to an extent. So far there haven't really been any strikes against her credibility, except for the fact that she once wrote a blog post in praise of Vladimir Putin, which is
who hasn't?
Just you can just imagine how that's going to set off a bunch of these
yes.
Warren stands and Biden stands.
Russia bots. Oh my God.
It's
wow.
It's the real deal here. So,
but I mean, in seriousness, it seems that we know that with Trump that sort of stuff wouldn't stick. I mean, the whole idea of Trump is in some ways that stuff never really matters for a lot of his supporters, because they see something else in him other than kind of probity, right? That's exactly not what he's selling. Whereas with the Democrats, that is pretty much all they sell. So it does seem to bite there, right?
Yeah, I think I completely agree. The thing with all of this is that Biden is not a well man either, right? And so you kind of just at a certain point have to put your head in your hands and go like, wait a second, like, how did we get here? Like, this can't be real. Absolutely. This can't be real. There's something sort of fantastical about this, where you're just like, this is a nightmare. I want to get off this train. I'm not happy here. I don't understand how this happened at all. So
it's really striking. I actually recently only watched videos of him in debates and his speeches when he was much younger. And the contrast is really dramatic and striking. I mean, even accounting for age in general, very forceful, powerful debater and speaker. And it's just, despite kind of opposing everything he stands for politically, you can't help but feel genuinely sorry for him. They're putting up what seems to be increasingly like an old sick man.
It's elder abuse.
Yeah, it's really, really depraved. And that point that was made by what's his face, Ben Judah, I think, the British Guardian correspondent. I think it was him, where he compared Biden to an American-style Brezhnev figure. Just the kind of the decrepitude, the gerontocracy, and radiating, just a kind of a political persona that radiates the decay of an entire political system. It's entirely right, it seems to me. That is what Biden represents. If this is who they choose to put up against Trump.
Yeah, and he can't even really articulate a politics for coronavirus either. He's seemingly holed up in his basement producing these YouTube videos, whatever, that are, emphatically failing to go viral. There was this big strategy leaked earlier on this week about like how they're trying to make him go viral, and they've got various comedians on to kind of sit with him and play cards with him over Zoom. And eat ice cream and swap anecdotes, because the whole idea, of course, is, Biden's selling point, if he has one, is that he does have a sort of a touch of authenticity about him. There were some moments, for example, in the when he was going in to be interviewed by the New York Times, there was a kind of an unscripted moment where he was in the elevator with a service worker. And, he just ended up sort of chatting with her informally. And, she was just like, oh, Mr. Biden, I think Mr. Vice President, whatever, I can't believe I'm meeting you. This is so awesome. He was just incredibly gracious towards her. And, that sort of human aspect was very much on display. And it cannot be gainsaid, I think, that, I hate saying this, but, in the last debate, he did pretty good against Bernie. It's a weird one to frame it this way, especially for maybe a British audience, because I know that, growing up in Ireland, whatever, I'm quite aware that debating culture is a rich part of the university experience in the British Isles and in Ireland. But a debate win in this country doesn't necessarily mean you slaughtered someone. It often just means you didn't put your foot in your mouth. And so Biden, maybe not destroying Bernie, but certainly not being destroyed by Bernie, didn't do any favors to the Bernie campaign at a time late in the day when it was already limping a little bit from having been defeated on Super Tuesday. So, it's a complicated one to speak about because, like, Biden does seem frail. There's more than enough evidence at this stage to suggest that he's mentally struggling. But, I can't lie. Like he showed up. He can still show up at a debate stage.
That thing about
apparently.
Sorry, that thing about debating actually, and Phil might get angry at me for jumping forward here, but it does seem like a good moment to bring it up, precisely because the tone of American politics, especially from an outsider's perspective, or certainly someone who's familiar with Britain, where I think maybe even just kind of vulgarity is a little bit more accepted, and where something like the kind of, the so-called dirtbag left and whatever, that whole approach wouldn't be so needed in somewhere like Britain, because there's more of a culture of like slagging off politicians, right? Whereas in the US, and especially amongst kind of establishment politics, and probably more than anything within the Democrats, there's such an emphasis on decorum, that and the kind of and etiquette and whatnot, that to try to puncture that bubble seemed quite important from a radical perspective. And I bring that up because I wanted to make reference to a piece that came out in Jacobin maybe 2 weeks ago or so on by David Sirota, who's a senior advisor to the Bernie campaign, and who argued, I mean, he makes various points throughout the article, but the fundamental one is that Bernie did not make enough of an effort to distinguish himself from Biden in terms of his politics, in terms of his policies, in terms of his record, in terms of his whole demeanor, and that it was, in some ways, the campaign seemed to have bought in too much into the decorum of Democratic Party politics, and that prevented him from really making those necessary distinctions between Bernie's politics and the kind of establishment Democrat ones. Do you buy that argument? And do you think that is a real issue?
I think there is a decorum tyranny, so to speak, to use Sirota's phrase, in the United States. I honestly, living here 20 years now, whatever it is, I haven't ever really been able to fully figure it out. So you may recall Howard Dean's campaign and his spectacular implosion over what essentially is a very trivial thing, something that actually you would think would be an essential part of American culture, because if you look at any movie, from Full Metal Jacket to any other kind of, military film, or rallying the office to a specific cause, any of these sort of scenarios that show up regularly in American fiction, there's an awful lot of firing up the troops. There's an awful lot of rallying the boys to the flag, and to see someone just so summarily executed in the media for something so trivial says a lot, I think, about how easy it is to deploy that trope in American politics. So people avoid it like a minefield. And Bernie already, of course, had this reputation of being gruff. He was systematically, like before Super Tuesday already, pundits were describing him varyingly as a sexist, curmudgeonly, vulgar, even a left-wing version of Trump. And I mean, I don't know how much of this crossed the Atlantic, but I'll just give you a couple of really powerful details. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, sorry, just to jump in here. I guess it was the major way that he was constructed as angry. I mean, there are some tweets.
But it was more than angry,
saying that his shouting made their children or their baby cry. I mean, so was it that he was kind of breaking decorum by being too vulgar, or was he expressing kind of political emotions like anger at injustice, which are verboten for a variety of reasons?
It's difficult to disentangle all of it. A lot of it, I think, might be to do with the fact that his base, so to speak, young Twitter using base, does tend towards irony style shitposting, if I can use that language on a podcast. Famously then you had people like Chuck Todd and NBC referring to the Bernie campaign as a digital brown shirt brigade, and you even had Chris Matthews comparing Bernie's victory in Nevada to the Nazis taking control of France. So
exactly
there was. It's exactly the same thing, right? So, but so this is I think two things going on here. One is if you want to sort of get a bit Noam Chomsky manufacturing consent, it's the use of gatekeeping, and it is the sort of stamping out by the media machine of dissent. Some of it was very fraudulently done, though. I mean, there's a famous clip of Trevor Noah on The Daily Show using an edited video basically to make it look like Bernie was being mean to children, when in fact, if you actually looked at the original video, he was telling them, to believe in themselves. And, so this kind of thing was the sort of more deliberate version of it. But I think I think there is genuinely a kind of a guardrail sensibility, to borrow a current phrase, that is on display when you see genuine, I think, grievance of people like Chuck Todd on NBC, or Rachel Maddow is a classic case in point in this. I mean, she just barely was able to hide her disdain for Bernie Sanders in the early part of this year, at least. So there's no doubt that it's a reality that any left-wing leaning politician would have to face. I don't think it's as bad as the British one, though. I don't think it's as bad as the British media. That's to be sure.
I think that might be true, and I think a lot of the discussion on the left was, well, they are. The mainstream media is instrumentalizing this idea of Bernie being too angry or too vulgar or too etc., or the Bernie bros being too vulgar to attack him, and in a way that they wouldn't do with anyone else. And the British media also did the same with Corbyn and whatnot. And how you respond to that is another question. I think we've made the point a number of times on this podcast. You have to take it as read that the establishment, whether it be the media or political institutions, are not going to treat the left fairly. Like, okay, that's where you have to start from. You can't expect a level playing field. But I did want to reflect a little bit on what might, just this question of tone, because it did seem to come up so much that it did perplex me, and to try to understand whether it's something that is particularly American, this notion of trying to maintain decorum, and to what extent it's something that's a little bit more universal, because it is the kind of the dominant tone of post-politics, right? You're not allowed to be angry. You have to be very, hold things together and be moderate and rational, and, discuss things and be tolerant and so on, so that basically real grievance can't be voiced, other than to say, I'm a victim. So, you can present yourself as a victim, whether it be a victim of sexual abuse or a kind of more humanitarian victim, that need begging for help. But to be angry about something and to claim your rights, that's seen as verboten today. And I think that's maybe something that goes a little bit beyond just, what happens in the US. I think that's in many different places around the world. But the American version of that seems to be even more tightly held together by this kind of tone policing and discourse ethics. Do you agree with that? I think it's worth trying to for our listeners as well, trying to shine a light on the US from the outside.
Well, there's been this kind of interesting YouTube phenomena this year with the presence and rise to notoriety of a young lady by the name of Crystal Ball. I don't know if I should say young lady, but whatever, and her co-host Sagar Enjeti. And they run this show called Rising. And what's really, really interesting is how it is a complete sort of backlash against all of this, right? So they constantly are criticizing the sort of guardrail politics of the American mainstream liberal class. Now, I think that there is something there. I mean, I do think that there is an argument. I think there's clearly a sort of a tone policing that goes on. On the other hand, I also don't know if it's just cultural. And this is the thing that I struggle with about this whole election, to be honest with you. I have a hard time. There's a little bit of me that's a conspiracy theorist, unfortunately. And as much as I try to stamp it out, this election cycle just handed so much of it to me on a plate. If you look at the data, it wasn't just that Bernie was being talked about as impolite. I mean, he was systematically not allowed speak. The mainstream media did not give him anything like an equal number of words, spoken by candidates as in terms of how the various percentages that they would garner on different shows. I mean, this has been studied already. So, they paid a little bit of attention to him as he won the first three primaries, and then gave him a bit of speaking time the day after Super Tuesday, when the corporate Democrats had obviously already consolidated their win. But really, apart from that, it was Bernie was being more talked about than given a voice himself. Now, in fairness to him, I think Bernie's media strategy this year was light years ahead of where it was in 2016. He had, a very talented, if perhaps divisive lately, figure of Brianna Joy Gray, doing podcasts and things like this. I think, whereas in 2016, Bernie was kind of, I think, not having an infrastructure and having, a bare bones campaign to start with, very much dependent on surrogates. He was dependent on the Young Turks. He was dependent on other, renegade, marginal media outfits that are, powerful and impressive in their own little universes, but they're not necessarily going to change the way the mainstream American voter is deciding to go come election day. So I think, those sort of early days of ad hoc media strategies, won Bernie a huge vote in terms of authenticity in 2016. This time around, he needed something more serious. And I feel like he did rise to the occasion. And this sort of leads me to a question which I think we could probably return to later on, which is, was there really a flaw in the Bernie Sanders campaign? Did Bernie do anything wrong?
I guess there's one of our questions. But before we get to that,
go on, Phil.
I just wanted to ask you, Nick, if you could, and this is what we asked our last guest in this series, and what we'll ask the next guest in the series, if you could tell us a bit about tell us a little bit about how the campaign went in your personal experience, and if there was any standout moments in the campaign trail that you felt gave you a particular insight or understanding into the politics of the election, of the primary, that you didn't have before.
Yeah, I think there's probably 2 or 3 examples I would give there, but they're going to speak to different kind of dynamics, and so one would be the endorsement from Joe Rogan. And then the other would be what happened in Iowa. And again, remember earlier on, I said I'm a little bit of a conspiracy theorist. So I hate that I'm like that. Like, it's not something I want to be. I'm a political theorist or a political scientist, whatever. I'm supposed to be dealing in, deductive reasoning here. But what happened at Iowa leaves me with major questions still to this day. But just to speak to the Rogan endorsement for a minute, I think that's very instructive for the tenor of what we've just been talking about, the civility politics aspect. I was not quite ready to see the response to that from the wider left that I did. And I admit I still am taken aback by it. Joe Rogan, of course, is someone who's sort of been all over the radar, both in terms of his career and his political affiliations. But in more recent years, he's the most famous podcaster on planet Earth, basically. He does a show where he interviews a lot of different people, like including a lot of bodybuilders, about vitamin supplements and this kind of thing. He's seen as kind of the ordinary American man in some ways, or at least a voice for the ordinary American. He is his show would be a safe space for masculinity and things like this, but he's not necessarily an offensive figure or a particularly racist figure or anything like that. Like, I mean, he's sometimes framed that way by some members of the left, but that, any scrutiny of his history shows that he has someone who's been moving to the center slowly over the years, but from a very sort of an ordinary Joe, if you'll forgive the expression, sort of place. And he basically said, having had Bernie on his show, and a lot of people had wanted to be on his show. Warren wanted to be on there. Biden wanted to be on there. There's documentation showing that, and Joe Rogan's show has attested that these people did approach him to come on their show. So they wanted to get on Joe Rogan. There's no question about it.
Did Mayor Pete want to go on the show as well?
I don't know if Mayor Pete wanted to go on the show. He may have. You may have some information there that I don't have, but anyway, Joe just had Bernie on. It's his show. He can do what he wants, right? So he says, I think a few days later or the next week or something, I think I'm going to vote for Bernie, and it caused war, and that to me was just, it wasn't just that it was people were upset. It was the way they were upset. They were really calling Joe out for being some kind of entity from the primordial soup, So the other thing that I think really surprised me, and again, it's sort of like, well, nothing should surprise me, but it's what happened in Iowa, right? And this is something I think this has definitely been forgotten about now in the kind of wider narrative of the election. You see a lot of people talking about, the future. You see a lot of people talking about, whether we should be a third party or not. You see a lot of people talking about civility politics, but there is a major question mark over what happened in Iowa. The caucus, as you may know, Iowa is a caucus system. So that means it doesn't exactly work where you write down a vote and put it in a ballot box. You show up at a town hall, or you show up at your local Boy Scouts room or whatever, or you show up at a specially designated place in a post office or a hospital, and you go through this kind of bizarre system where you walk around the room talking to different groups, and then you stand with the group that you're going to align yourself with, and they then count as the votes going forward from that district for the different candidates. Mm-hmm. The app that was deployed only a couple of months before the caucus took place broke, and it delayed the reporting of the votes dramatically, but only after Bernie Sanders being basically quite far in the lead. And so they shut it down, even the faulty app, that is, they shut that down right before, a bunch of districts were about to report that would have really put Bernie over the edge.
Yeah, I think this was used to justify a coup in Bolivia, basically. So, right?
Right,
I mean,
yeah. But I mean, what's interesting is that the firm that made the app was called Shadow, and it had received money from the Iowa Democratic Party, which is fair enough, but also from Mayor Pete's campaign, and it had been vetted by Robbie Mook, who was, of course, Hillary Rodham Clinton's campaign manager. And I think, there's potentially two lessons there, but again, one is just, don't be surprised by the extent to which the Democrats will, arrange for you to lose if they can. I'm kind of half joking about being a conspiracy theorist about it, but because obviously that's not necessary. The political science story here is that the Democratic Party is run by elite grifters, and that those elites know an opportunity when they see one.
Yeah, I mean,
So,
I don't know that, the notion that dodgy things happened with the app in Iowa. I don't think that is counts necessarily as conspiracy theory. It seems to me it's legit. It seems to me there's enough legitimate issues there to raise an eyebrow, like you say, and given the well-known ruthlessness of Democratic Party elites, it doesn't seem to me an extreme proposition.
Yeah,
just before we move on,
but before we move on, I think this is an important point to investigate a bit more. I mean, should we be surprised? I mean, this you mentioned a couple of times being
we said we're not
conspiracy
right?
theorists. Yeah. So what are the lessons that we can learn from this? We don't. It's not the case that the left plays by the same rules as the establishment Democrats. I mean, what do you think there have actually been any lessons learned about how this, it's not the same playing field for these two groups? I mean, do you think this is really something that's going to be, in some ways, a kind of a silver lining here, that there's going to be?
I don't understand the question. Are you suggesting that the Bernie crowd should have played as dirty as trying to fix apps to make sure that in case the other side looked like it was winning, that suddenly the reporting system crashed? I mean, what are you suggesting?
It's a question for Nick, obviously. But yeah, just that the
shameless
sorry, but yeah, I mean, just do you think that this will filter through? Because otherwise there's going to be potentially a situation, next time or the time after that, where there's going to be outrage and there's going to be shock and surprise at the fact that people will bend the rules to win at politics, and that's not that's not going to help anybody if the left thinks, okay, we need to play by the rules of being civil and all that sort of thing. Do you think it's going to be a lesson learned?
George, I think it's kind of, you got to look at it kind of in the context of a continuum from 2016 to the present day, right? So we whatever, the left definitely got unfairly abused in the process in 2016. There's no doubt about it. When you look at some of the shenanigans that took place, the lack of transparency in the caucus system, for example, Nevada was a particular example there. There were notable controversies about how the Clinton establishment was working with Democratic insiders that were in powerful positions in Nevada and other states, and part of Bernie's concession at the convention in 2016 was to try to introduce reforms that would fix these situations and make sure that they couldn't happen again. And I think that those reforms worked. Without getting into too many details, though, I think the thing is, new strategies were deployed this time to undermine Bernie, and so you don't always see them coming. Remember that this is not a sort of a veteran left. This is a relatively new teenager left, right? Like it's just learning to strut its stuff. It doesn't necessarily have hardened campaign managers who know what all the moves are and know the checklist of things to be looking into as the the timeline progresses. I think I'm not trying to necessarily offer excuses, but I think, for example, no one could have anticipated Iowa going the way it went, and certainly Iowa aside, because I mean in the end Bernie won that, but the point there wasn't so much to stop Bernie winning as to prevent him having his victory march, which I think you can see that kind of effort to sort of put a spanner in the works of the momentum of Bernie again then later on Super Tuesday, which is of course the day it all turned around. What I would sort of say is that, look, the Bernie campaign was working until it wasn't, and
so we'll get to the kind of the question of when it when it might have
see what you're saying,
or what the failure was. But I suppose before that, I wondered if there was anything from your door knocking experience, flyer leafleting, from kind of face-to-face contact with people when you were making the case for Bernie. Was there anything from that changed your mind about or gave you a new insight into the process, which you didn't have before having participated in the kind of face-to-face politics of it?
I actually was on sabbatical in Ireland in 2016, which was kind of frustrating for me because I was obviously very much in the Bernie column then as well. And so I, even though I've lived in the United States almost like my entire last 20 years of my life, I found myself watching the whole thing from Ireland then, and in a sense, then I never really got a kind of a tangible sense of what it was like to live in a Bernie wave, right? To breathe that air, to drink that water, right? And to be here actually for it was remarkable because, of course, a lot of the people who were sort of seen as the mascots and the proxies, the surrogates of Bernie last time when he was sort of stringing his campaign together with God's glue. This time around it was more organized, and this time around people were more serious about it, and there were some just profoundly touching moments. As for example, as flawed as DSA might sometimes appear to be to outside observers, there were wonderful sort of ways in which you saw I don't know, like the podcast Chapo Trap House, whatever, teaming up with DSA to go on tour in California in a funky, bizarre bus that they made, and just in a sense trying to bring the message out to the people using very creative ways of campaigning, canvassing, being original, bringing comedy to it, and that I think that combined with things like Joe Rogan, whatever. I mean, I think it genuinely gave people like me a sense that there's momentum here. This can actually happen. So I hadn't gotten to be part of that in 2016. I did get to be part of it this time around. This is an area where I live. Like, I'm relatively new living here, so I don't know the political heartbeat of the place that well yet. But in the course of time that I was here campaigning, that is, so many people came out to walk the streets, to get involved, to canvass. And there's a lovely way of canvassing down here where people are very sort of, open-minded. They make food for each other, and they're very generous towards each other as they're going around on their, door knocking. I think that aspect of it was very warming. But it was, at the end of the day, again, it is a kind of a conservative area, and so. We did obviously find there were a lot of people who wouldn't open their doors, or if they did open their doors, they weren't that interested. I would say maybe of 10 doors I would knock on, I would get maybe one person to open up. And of the people I spoke to, half were Bernie supporters, though, which was gratifying because it meant that, like, of the people I did speak to, a good number of them, half of them at least, were Bernie supporters, and I think that did translate at the end of the day in the polling results. The other half were, a name we haven't mentioned yet, Bloomberg supporters by and large. Bloomberg, we haven't really talked about. Yeah, there was massive support for Bloomberg in Texas, massive support for Bloomberg. And we haven't talked about him very much.
What was the nature of that? Because it seemed to have disappeared, and it was always this kind of maybe sort of stalking horse campaign, but where there was just such an unlimited pool of money there that you always thought it would never really go away, and maybe it still won't. I mean, who knows? Maybe I don't know what the latest is. Maybe he ends up appearing if Biden dies or whatever. So I mean, what did you find, at least on the ground level? What was the appeal of Michael Bloomberg?
It was a very.
What was his appeal?
No, there was no appeal really, except the same kind of appeal that a lot of the other candidates. Because remember, it was a very populated primary series, right? Like, you had a lot of candidates running, which is kind of uncharacteristic for the Democrats. I think it was 23 people at one point in time.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of these people were kind of betting on the same thing. So Bernie's a little bit different. because Bernie knew, and maybe Warren to a certain degree, they knew that they had a base and they knew that they had a voting bloc that they could count on. Everyone else was just waiting for that kind of catalytical moment where they would become, in the minds of ordinary American voters, the person that everyone was going to get behind. And so everyone was really kind of just like drawing out their funding, burning their donations until such time as they could get to that point where that critical mass would be achieved. And the idea, of course, and they were right at the end of the day. I mean, these campaigns were all betting on the same strategy, including Bloomberg, although Bloomberg did it with fuckloads of money. But I mean, you know, the idea being that, look, everyone wants Trump out, and if you can be the person that everyone, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, believes is the person that everyone's getting behind, then that kind of crowd effect is going to carry you basically to the nomination. Now, I don't know that the Bernie campaign didn't see that coming. I think it was not necessarily clear that it was going to happen at Super Tuesday, which we'll talk about in a minute. But Bloomberg certainly was, I think, playing that strategy. He definitely wanted to sort of take it to that point, and as soon as it became clear, I mean, Bloomberg was going to pull out the same moment everyone else was going to pull out, right? When it became clear that everyone was getting behind one person, and that person was the nominee, there was absolutely no point for any of them to stay on, because they weren't going to get the momentum, and they might, in fact, end up dividing the camp between Biden and them, and so therefore give Bernie a greater chance of getting the nomination, which was another primary objective that they wanted to avoid.
I mean, and the whole process, of course, is rather complicated, you know, to put it kind of kindly, in terms of the need for momentum that these early states matter so much and so on. But I think if one compares it to 2016, you know, the Bernie thing kind of came out of the blue, and, you know, you hoped that it might happen, but you weren't sure. This time there was so much momentum going into it, and notwithstanding the Democratic Party rat fucking, it still seems like a huge disappointment the way it fell apart so quickly, it seemed. That it just took Biden's victory in South Carolina, and then already things started to swing around. And I think it does demand asking hard questions, and lots of people you know, are doing that. There's also a lot of people kind of congratulating themselves for work done so far and what's been built. And I don't think one should completely be dismissive, but at the same time, you know, eye on the prize, and one should be, you know, hard with oneself. The left should be self-critical. And so maybe with the aim of doing that, I mean, I wanted to maybe refer to some of the arguments made, you know, some arguments made in Jacobin. We were just talking about this obviously before we started recording, but so one of these, to set it up, is that appraisals of Bernie seem torn between the establishment being very strong, i.e., the establishment was able to crush Bernie. They were able to rat fuck him. You know, the media didn't give him airtime, all the rest of it. And then there's an argument which is made almost at the same time but you know, the establishment is very weak. You know, Bernie was able to break through. The field was split with no good mainstream candidate. The Democrats are all at sea. They're very vulnerable to a populist insurgent campaign, as 2016 showed. So, I mean, you know, is the establishment, when we say the establishment, I really mean the Democratic Party establishment, is it very weak, or is it very strong, or is it maybe both, and they refer to sort of different elements of how the party works? What do you think?
Is it weak or is it strong? I mean, I think that is the key question. The fact of the matter is, when you look at Super Tuesday and how, with just, I think, a couple of calls from Obama to kind of a broker or a range, and I'm not sure, you know, what the quid pro quos would have been, probably a little bit for everyone in the audience at that stage. But, you know, Klobuchar pulls out, Buttigieg pulls out March 1st, March 2nd. Warren would stay in a little longer, but just in order to wreck Bernie in Minnesota and in Massachusetts. You know, had Warren, I mean, there was clear coordination. You know, there were more than one media outlet reporting that Obama had gotten involved at that point in time. So again, it was just that kind of effort to sort of sound the bugle call and to rally the troops towards a signal figure that was going to be the one that everyone decided could beat Trump on the basis of electability. The Democratic establishment and their media proxies had spent the entire spring making the electability argument that Bernie, casting doubt to the idea of Bernie being electable, and so what is interesting is how, with just one or two minor shifts in variables, it could have gone very differently for them. And this is something that I think I personally want to emphasize. You cannot say that the Democratic Party is all powerful here. They made major mistakes. Like what happened in Iowa should never have been made public. And the fact that it was in the way that it was, I think, shows how incompetent they are. They're bunglers at the end of the day. They're very, very invested in protecting their own jobs and their own access within the Democratic Party. They know that if Bernie were ever to become president, or if the Bernie wing were ever to become powerful within the Democratic Party, they'd all be out on their ear. So, the motivations are very, very clear from their point of view. Just coming back to Minneapolis and Massachusetts, or Minnesota and Massachusetts rather, the party, had those gone another way, had those two states gone in a different direction, Warren got 15% of the vote in Minnesota. Bernie got 30% of the vote in Minnesota. Biden got 38%. Now, it's a decisive win for Biden, but Warren getting 15% of the vote that late in her campaign, I mean, that's ridiculous. Like there's that was enough of the progressive vote, I think, to hurt Bernie. I'm not saying that Bernie would have necessarily won that vote. I think even Klobuchar got 5% of the vote, even though she was technically out on the third. But I just want to emphasize that those two states could have gone very differently if Warren was not in it, and if Bernie had won those two states, they would not have put him ahead by the time coronavirus hit, but they would have made the game look very differently when the coronavirus lockdown started, and it would have really denied momentum. So the point is, in 2016, there really was a kind of a two-horse race momentum, and Bernie was doing well within that. Adding the Trump factor, the fact is most rank-and-file Democratic voters have one priority, and that's to get him out of there.
Yeah. Go ahead, George.
Go on, Al. I guess I was just going to ask the question: is that do you think if Bernie had been successful, I mean, would he have actually been able to defeat Trump? Because I think there are some obviously there are some weaknesses and limitations in the Bernie movement. I mean, I don't know if that's the right question to ask though, because it is quite hypothetical, and it may be it's kind of wishful thinking. It's like, oh, we could have got rid of Trump if Bernie had won. I mean, is that really the right question to ask? I realized that I did kind of interrupt to ask that question and then say it might not be the right question to ask. But that's that's discourse, that's debate, that's auto-critique. All of these things, it's all valid. So yeah, make of that what you will.
I mean, I don't think Bernie has. I'm just going to pick things off the top of my head here because I don't have like a rehearsed answer to that particular question, except to say countless polling has shown since 2016 that Bernie is one of the most, if not the most popular politician on the left side of the spectrum in the United States. He is a real brand name figure. He doesn't have sexual harassment charges hanging over him. I don't think that
has to be highlighted. Yeah.
No. I'm just saying, like, if you're looking at where we are now, you've got a major brand name. Yeah.
It's not a total piece of shit.
We have two candidates vying against each other in November who are, not to sort of trundle out some hackneyed language here or anything, but like older white men with questionable morality. It's not trivial to me that Bernie would have entered into a runoff with Trump with some of the most popular policies in the country under his belt, Medicare for all, etc. Not having voted for the Iraq War, and
this
ultimately not just being a more decent person than Trump at the end of the day. It can be that simple in some ways, right? Like
this pushes us though to, I suppose, a larger question, which is the and the thing which is picked up in the Dustin Westella piece, which is which was written in Jacobin in the kind of post-mortem of the Bernie campaign, is the question of the third party, the perennial issue for the left of the Democrats and those to the left of the Democrats, whether or not it's worth continuing in this fantastically kind of corrupt and elitist party, or whether it's worth splitting from it and trying to construct something outside of it. So where do you fall on the issue?
Well, I think I agree with Dustin and other people like him in this debate. I think I listened to a live talk that Dustin gave, I think, to a DSA chapter in Philadelphia, and I remember him saying it was kind of like, when it comes to this debate, you've got the kind of clowns to the left of you, jokers to the right problem. On the one hand, you have who are the jokers here? The jokers are going to be people. I don't know if this name is familiar to British listeners, but American listeners will certainly know the name Sean McElwee. And he is someone who has sort of made a name for himself as a data analyst. He's kind of like the left's version of Nate Silver. And supposedly he has like all the magic recipes in his cookbook to help progressive candidates win. And his argument again now, so it's clowns to the left, you jokers to the right. So to the right you have Warren and the Warren campaign people who consider themselves progressive in many, many respects, but are drawn largely from middle class, maybe more intellectual career people. So McElwee is basically arguing that Bernie lost because he couldn't break out of the working class base, right? And his argument is there's only so many of them that are going to be Bernie aware or aware of left-wing politics. That's the most you can squeeze from that sponge. So you need to be able to do more than that. And of course, this is the basis of the argument in some ways, going back to the Sirota piece just briefly. There are a lot of people who believe that Bernie then on this basis should have been nicer, right? This is, of course, you may have seen this, but there was a really remarkable open letter published in The Nation in the last week or two, where Todd Gitlin and a bunch of former members of the SDS, Students for a Democratic Society, wrote this open letter to Bernie, basically saying that Bernie hadn't been doing enough, Bernie supporters hadn't been doing enough to rally to Joe Biden, and that this was critical because, of course, Trump is Hitler. So I sort of align all of these kinds of people together in some ways, right? Like the Bernie is on the one hand being seen as too nice. On the other hand, Bernie should have been nicer, or Bernie should play ball, I think is ultimately the combined argument that you really get from it. And of course, I mean, I think in some ways there's some truth to it. It could be, there could maybe be an argument, for example, that Bernie was not the best himself as a person in terms of playing the game of American politics, right? And I understand, for example, people who are critical of him for not even having tried to court Jim Clyburn, for example. That's the Democratic House Majority Whip whose endorsement really sealed the deal for Biden in South Carolina. But then again, Bernie is Bernie, and he's never played that traditional political game ever in his career. If you read his bio, it's just never been part of his shtick. He's always been a people power guy, and so I where I would come in on this is like, if the Clyburn endorsement is your metric, then you've lost. That Bernie's just not your guy. You can't ask him to do that kind of politics.
But then, you lean to a third party then.
No, I don't know that I do. I think somewhere between the Bernie was too nice argument and then the argument that Bernie was too mean, you have another position, which is that Bernie is, ultimately someone who was coming. He was a figurehead of a very young movement that is still learning how to operate politically. I'm thinking, and I know some of you guys on your own show have sort of called this moment the end of the populist sort of phase of politics, and I've heard Anton Yeager make the same point, and I respect that in some ways, like, because I'm disappointed too, right? Like, I'd love to have seen Podemos and Corbyn and everyone like do much better than they have, and not just become.
Sorry, Nick. Where is the disappointment though? Is the disappointment Bernie not achieving the nomination, or is it him basically kind of tacking behind Biden and which one of those two is it? Because it seems like it was probably always a long shot for him to kind of succeed outside of the Democratic Party and to actually win the nomination, win the presidency. But there could have been an insurgency maybe within the terms of the Democrats more easily. I guess that's one of my sort of questions that I'd have in this.
So Micah Utrecht and Megan Day have a book out where they, just in the last few weeks, where they make the argument that, the third party contention, is around a long time, and it hasn't necessarily borne any fruit, right? We have got much further this route of running within the Democratic Party than we have with any other strategy. Pardon me?
God, where?
Well, as I was just arguing a moment ago, I'm glad you're asking me these questions. I'm glad you're asking me these questions because they're good questions. But as I was just arguing a moment ago, things could have gone very different in Minneapolis. Things could have gone very different in Massachusetts. And I think that, what's incredible is how close it actually was. So that might not be enough. I mean, it might be a day late and a dollar short, and I accept that. But again, the point being that it's a very young movement, and I think it's still learning how to operate. So my point, if I could just sort of to get to the punchline, is while I share what I would say is your disappointment, you may not be disappointed, but to me it seems very disappointing, at least. That we didn't get further this time. On the other hand, I recognize that a third party strategy has not really historically borne fruit. We did get quite far this time, and there's a very clear sense, as Guastella argues, in fairness, because that's the piece you were citing. And he also is, I think, someone who would be swapping battle stories with Megan Day and Micah Utrecht in their book as well, because I think they move in the same circles. That the idea would be from here, you now start to enter into a different phase, right? You start to enter into what maybe would be known as a rank and file phase, where you start to see organizations like the Democratic Socialists of America. Like, obviously history is not written. You can't predict the future, but and DSA could go the wrong direction. There's some tendencies in there that I'm not a big fan of myself, but I think if you start to see an organization like that potentially enter into the workplace, helping to organize on the shop floor, find where there's nascent energies that are already oriented towards the left. There's something, there's an opportunity to be reaped there. There's a possibility that you're going to be able to create something that would actually be the only real stopgap that I can imagine that would prevent something happening like what happened after Super Tuesday moving forward, which is that you would have your own movement, your own major figures that you could kind of deploy that would basically be able to tell Elizabeth Warren to get out of the race at a certain point in time, right?
Yeah,
like
I'm quite crude about this. I think in a number of ways that
yeah,
for me it's almost the as soon as Bernie is willing to sort of accept the possibility of a character like Biden within the Democratic Party, that really saps the movement of a lot of its energy. That's I think kind of almost a capitulation, because it's like, for most people, what's the real difference between Biden and Trump? I mean, not for most people, but maybe for many Bernie supporters. And I mean, maybe that was always a limitation that was inherent within the Sanders campaign. But I think it's, I mean, you can put it in a number of different ways, but I think that is a real limit, that there wasn't an ability to sort of say, well, actually, this is a really different form of politics, and I think Bernie has a number of strengths as a movement politician, and personally very likable. But if you're operating within the constraints of the kind of establishment Democratic Party, and that's ultimately proved by tacking behind Biden, then it's a really, I don't know, it's important, I think, not to get too it feels to me not to get too invested in Bernie, because that was probably always the end point that we were going to see within kind of American left populism.
One of the, I'd like to sort of answer that or respond to that with an anecdote, if I may. I used to live in Columbus, Ohio. I lived there for 8 years, and I was in Ohio for 10 years. Like many people, after 2016, I'd never have heard of the DSA before, but I suddenly did become aware of it. And as I had mentioned earlier on, I was on sabbatical in Ireland for the election. But when I moved back, it was clear there was a lot of momentum for this organization. And so I signed up, and I became a member of the Columbus chapter, and I met some great people there, and I'm still in touch with a few of them. I was reading an article in Politico earlier on this year by Tim Alberta. This came out I think in March, and it was right before the South Carolina vote. And it was a series of interviews in a piece Tim Alberta had written after a weekend hanging out with DSA Columbus members, right? So I knew some of these names, I knew some of these faces that he was interviewing. Just random coincidence, I suppose, that he'd chosen Columbus. He could have chosen Cincinnati or Cleveland, right? But what was very, very interesting were two things. One is that the members, very young often, but these members were of a mind that the point was not to necessarily run a Bernie campaign, that there was a longer term strategy that needed to be in play. And I think, in some ways, great. It's lovely to see, and it's important to see that focus on a longer term strategy. The problem and the concern that I had was that whole time in that interview, right, it was never expressed what it meant for the left to have a strategy of entering the state or to engage with the working class in a national strategic sense, or that it was even a priority. Instead, it was very much this kind of, you guys talk about this kind of thing on your show sometimes, like this sort of focus on folk politics, on localism. And, there was just this one quote that stood out to me. I'll read it for you if I may, and you can, if it's relevant. It's from a young lady. I won't mention her name. I've never met her, so there's no point, but in the piece, people can check it out in Politico. It's by Tim Alberta. She says, "We've been building this movement to exist outside of electoral politics." Listen to that, right? We've been building this movement to exist outside of electoral politics. Yeah. This campaign is one fight for us, but the bigger battles for social change will go on regardless of what happens with Bernie, she said. That's why we should focus on local politics anyway. It doesn't matter who the president is. We need to build local organizations that have a longer lasting impact than electing one president. To me, these housing ordinance fights in Columbus are just as important as Medicare for all, because it's an issue we see affecting people's lives here every single day. So guys, don't get me wrong. On the one hand, I do think that sort of stuff, like fighting for property issues or housing issues, is super important. But on its own, unalloyed to any kind of electoral strategy, all you're doing there really is just trying to shift the Overton window, right? And I think the game of power in American politics today is about much more than just trying to legitimize certain discourses, right?
Totally.
The lesson of the anti-war movement still lingers very heavily in my mind. I was already living in this country back then, and I saw how quickly it disappeared. And I don't think DSA is quite as bad as that, but I mean, it's not a very big organization, and it's a very fragile organization in that sense. To me, it can come and go quite quickly.
Right. I mean,
yeah, please.
Can I just interrupt? I mean, this seems to be getting to the nub of it, because there seems to be this false dichotomy that you have either, you play the electoral game and very directly target the presidency. Not even just we're going to put candidates down ballot across the country. It's we're going to win the presidency through Bernie. And on the other, you have, that didn't work. We need to go back to like local initiatives, and we're not interested in electoralism. And there's obviously something in between those, and it's not just an either or. It seems to me that what you end up with, or rather, let me put it this way instead. Starting from the Guasatella piece, for instance, he makes the argument that we need to be patient. This was always maybe a long shot, and so on. Which I don't entirely buy that, because there's a lot of people very enthusiastic about the possibility that Bernie might indeed win the presidency, myself included. Yeah. So I think that's a bit of what's the word? Kind of after the fact, kind of trying to justify it. But fine. If you say we need to be patient, we need to build a movement, Rome wasn't built in a day, fine. But at the same time, dismissing the possibility of building a third party because, well, that's just oblivion and we need to target the presidency immediately. And it's like, well, that seems to be a contradiction there. If you're going to preach patience and the slow build towards socialism, cool, I'm on board. But then you have to be willing to countenance other possibilities. So to sum it up in a different way, it seems that you want clarity of aims, i.e. socialism, or at least movement or party building, and a strategic flexibility, which is willing to be opportunistic in different ways towards that goal. So, if a run to the presidency through Bernie might build the movement, cool, go for it. And what ended up happening is you got it backwards. So you ended up with a lack of clarity of aims, where the kind of socialism is abandoned to the narrow ends of electoralism, with a strategic inflexibility where you're like, well, we're going to stick to the Dems no matter what, and Bernie is going to endorse the candidate even if he's a shitbag like Biden. And it's like, well, that leaves a bad taste in the mouth, doesn't it?
It's a great question. I'm simply saying I wish I was better qualified to answer it. But my understanding of his response, as it would be in the piece, is that, look, you have a very long history in this country of ineffectively trying to run third parties. The best that the left has ever done in this country, for example, in the Franklin Delano Roosevelt administration, was through mobilizing to pressure progressively oriented Democratic politicians, right? That, in a sense, that the reforms that you can implement that way tend to be the ones that shift the entire game leftwards and give you new opportunities. So I guess this is kind of a strategy that is adaptable and flexible depending on where you are. When you're very weak, you don't put all your eggs in the basket of a third party. It doesn't make any sense because you don't get anywhere with it. When you see momentum, when the sort of opportunity comes along, you'd be a fool to miss it, right? So the momentum developed around Bernie, like a lot of people, whatever more micro elements of the left, whatever in the US, I'm not going to name names, but they would have been very much, to me, looking like they were sitting on the fence and throwing rhetorical hand grenades, and it didn't strike me as very persuasive, and it didn't strike me as having a very serious attitude towards actually advancing the cause of left-wing politics in this country. Now, down the road, of course, once you have some kind of momentum, once you have your FDR in office, maybe there's an argument for potentially running a more extreme candidate then, via a third party. But I just, and so I'm not anti-third party per se. I just I'm not seeing how it would work in the United States context right now.
No, that's fine. I think that's a legitimate point of view. I'm not, haven't made my mind up about it, but I think I think one telling moment was in the discussion when Bernie still seemed to have a real chance was that, once Bernie gets in office, do you try to push him leftwards? Which I interpreted to mean get him to make more promises and to make, more kind of extreme policy, whatever it might be, whether it's to get him to commit to open borders or to whatever. Or do you defend him from attacks from the right? And I thought that neither of those. I mean, you can try to do both of those, but that's surely is completely missing the point. The fact is that Bernie himself would be tempted to backslide and tempted to compromise and to end up as a kind of bog stream. Bog stream. What is that? Bog stream. It's not the mainstream. It's the bog stream.
When you go to the bog and there's a stream.
It's a very, very vivid image, but not a nice one.
I'll start that again. No, the ends up as a bog standard mainstream Democrat, and so the need would be from those outside, formal politics, whether it's the DSA or whatever, to hold him to account and make sure that he implements his relatively limited promises that he did make. And everyone's discussing whether we should just defend him from attacks or whether we should push him leftwards as if he would have a free ride once he's in the presidency. And that seemed to me, that whole discussion, that whole debate seemed to misunderstand the nature of power and how improbable it is to have a kind of democratic socialist president and just allow him, the keys to the
Alex,
palace.
Can I jump in there with a counter question?
Yeah, go for it.
Who are these people having this debate? I don't know if I see anyone saying that he should be just defended from the right or pushed from the left. I mean, I think the serious debate that
voices in Alex's head, I think, ultimately.
No, I mean, but the debate, as I see it, just to be clear, the debate is about where we go from here, Bernie or not. The reality is the major reason Bernie did not do better, and I've been nuanced throughout all of this. I mean, I've tried to show.
No, make it brutal and blunt. Tell us
in my own stumbling, bumbling way here. I'm just an Irish boy from a sheep farm. Offering commentary on American politics here, but I've tried to show in a nuanced way, that there were various things that happened along the way at the micro level. The tactical level, if you will, that really played out strongly against Bernie. And I don't think you'll ever be able to kind of fully iron out the randomness of that, right? Like there's going to be tactical opportunities that come up that you weren't expecting, and there's going to be problems that come up along the way that you weren't expecting as well. I'm getting a little Donald Rumsfeld here, so forgive me. Let's just roll with it, okay? The unknown unknowns, but the strategically, I think it's very clear what went wrong. Once you leave the tactical level and you enter into the strategic, I mean, what's very clear is that the left in this country doesn't have an electoral strategy, precisely because it doesn't have its own party surrogate structure. And the only way to really address that, right, the only way to get those surrogates on the television that you see speaking for Biden all the time or speaking for Warren all the time, the only really way to grow those and build those, I think, is from a rank and file organizing strategy. And we're pretty far away from having that. It used to be the case that this country had it a lot more, but I think right now it's not there. And I would even add one further factor here, which is that, I'm very clear. I'm Team Jacobin, whatever, all the way. I totally agree with those guys that, going back to the working class, going back to labor is critical. That's the only real power source that's going to carry us into the White House and get the change that we want to see. But even building that in its own right will create change, because you don't actually need a Democratic president in the White House necessarily. You don't need a Bernie Sanders in the White House necessarily, I think, to make that difference. That there's other ways, using the strike.
Specifically on that point, then,
please go.
How do you? What do you think? I mean, so what are your predictions? What's going to happen? So Bern, we're not in the hypothetical world that Alex sketched out of how you might interact with the Bernie presidency, or how one might interact with the Bernie presidency. What are your predictions for what's going to happen? And particularly, how do you see COVID playing out? How do you see COVID? How does COVID affect the chips when they fall?
Well, that's a lot in there.
It's meant to be just a have a shot at it, because I think we're all going to be wrong, right?
I
think that's in the substance of it, we're all going to be wrong.
We're all going to make the predictions, but yeah, I mean, just your basic at this point in time, what's your gut instinct telling you is going to happen in November?
You can put money on it, but you don't have to.
Right. Look, coronavirus, DSA, China. I mean, these are the things that are on my mind right now. I know, right? So I think just looking at the job figures that came out today, it's clear that something like in some states, you've up to 25% of the workforce unemployed right now. This is a disaster. I don't think the impact of this has been priced in yet. Trump is reopening the economy as we speak. Texas is going to be reopening partially, I think, as and from tomorrow. And that's where I live. And so obviously I'm worried about that. Now, look, I mean, there's different things to sort of factor in here. On the one hand, there was a great piece in Jacobin there in the last few days by Ben Burgess, where he was basically saying, look, maybe the left shouldn't be as critical of these gun-toting protesters that are showing up at shopping centers demanding their haircuts. That, I mean, everyone's seen the videos of these guys, and everyone knows that the kind of the dominant cultural response has been quite caustic towards them. But of course, they raise a point, and
it's a good piece.
And the point is, ordinary working class people do need to be able to pay their rent. And, while a lot of credit card companies are saying, oh, you don't have to pay your credit card this month, these are all postponements of debt owed. These are not cancellations of debt owed. And so depending on how long this goes on, it is great that people are getting a little relief, but it's, the bump at the end of this thing where all this rent and all these debt payments are suddenly due is going to be insane, right? I mean, it's going to cause a cataclysmic effect on the flow of credit in the country, I would think, unless, of course, mitigation strategies are put in place, but I don't see those coming from the Trump administration as of right now. So I don't think the economic thing is going to be looking great. I think Trump is going to be in trouble because of that. I think people are going to be looking for alternatives. So you
think Biden has a chance because of the economy?
Yeah, it won't. See, this is the thing. It's Biden, right? So Biden, anyone opposing Trump has a chance. Yeah. A wet sock has a chance against Trump in this economy, in the economy that I predict we're going to have. Yeah. Of course, I might be wrong, but we don't know where the Biden thing goes. I have a funny feeling. If you'd asked me this 2 weeks ago, I might have had a different answer. But I have a funny feeling that the sexual harassment stuff isn't going to go away. Yeah. I think there's momentum going to be gained out of that, and by the time the convention comes around, it's not clear. The polling looks good for Biden right now. I think in the head-to-head, but Biden's personal ratings are not great at all.
Yeah. So, George, what's your prediction?
Well, I think I've said this before, that the real issue for Trump is what his campaign actually is about. I mean, when you've had 4 years of doing that, haven't you had a bit of time to drain the swamp? But I still think the most likely outcome is going to be a Trump-Biden face-off. Not like the film Face Off. Would be more.
It should be like the film Face Off.
There'll be less Nicholas Cage than there should be. And I have money I have money on Trump winning again, which is not necessarily what I want to happen, but now I have a financial interest in it. Maybe it is. But yeah, I think that's what I see happening in
Alex,
in
tell us.
November.
I mean, I think there's something tragicomic about Biden ending up president, and I think it's evocative of the decline of the American empire. That somehow, you have this cataclysmic event, and you end up with Biden in the presidency. But
So for that
still
reason,
don't see
you
it.
can see it.
No. I think it's funny, but maybe it's this type of irony that our times deserve. But I would still bet on Trump, squeezing by.
Yeah, I think I would too. I suppose the real question is, as Nick raised, what happens at the convention? Partly for the sexual allegations. I think what Nick said is right; they're not going to go away. I think the sheer the sheer insanity of putting up a man who's so visibly decaying like Biden against Trump will continue to just become more and more obviously problematic as a political strategy. So it's I think perhaps, I'd still say Trump, but that's contingent on, I suppose, what happens at the Democratic convention, and if they do decide that they're going to replace Biden, or if Biden steps down, or whatever happens. So
can I just come in with one last question on that?
Sure.
Phil?
Yeah, sure.
If the Democrats were to pull a kind of a fast one at the convention and swap Biden out for someone else,
please let it be Hillary.
I don't know, man. But here's the thing, they lose automatically, don't they? Because that's unless there's
it looks like shenanigans. You mean?
It looks like absolute shenanigans.
Yeah.
And I just don't. Unless there's some kind of genuine, if Biden were to stroke out and just simply not be able to function, and it was a legitimate story, which who knows, then of course I think maybe it looks different, right? Then you could cruise out of the convention with a consensus candidate that represents the finest traditions of the American liberal class, an Obama type figure, a patrician, noble public speaker.
Maybe Obama as VP for Hillary as the presidential candidate.
Oh, yeah, or Obama's Michelle Obama might be someone like that. But either way, it would have to be this kind of person that would completely appeal to MSNBC, et cetera, right? So you might get a victory out of that, right? If it was someone who could really bring a coalition together. Biden on paper does bring that coalition together in some ways, but just not this Biden, right? Not Biden. Yeah, in his present state.
But he's failed a bunch of times before too, so I'm not sure if previous Bidens
but
either.
That was 25 years ago or something, wasn't it? Or even 50 years ago? When was his last presidential? I don't even remember.
Yeah.
It was a long time ago that Biden last tried to mount a presidential campaign, and of course, look, I'm not defending him. I'm just saying that he has potential, or he would have had maybe once upon a time a certain potential. Certainly, I think in 2016 he would have done a lot better than Hillary, for sure. But if it's just a bait and switch that takes place at the convention, and if it looks like nonsense or shenanigans, chicanery, I don't rate the Democrats' chances at all. And I think they would be better off leaving Biden where he is and just limping along.
The decline of the American empire continues apace.
Yeah, very much.
Yes, sure. That's a great place to leave it. We've gone on for longer than we expected, actually, but I think that's testimony to how interesting and wide-ranging the discussion's been. So thank you very much, Nick, for joining us.
Yeah, cheers, Nick.
Nice. Thank you so much.
Yeah, no, and we'll be back with another check-in on the United States, see how they're all doing over there in about 6 weeks' time in another Mr. Bunga Goes to Washington. But for now, that's it. Catch you later. Bye-bye.